na Globonews.
Lei do mais forte, lei da selva, seleção natural e evolução das espécies. Como foi explicado pelo pai da biologia moderna, Charles Darwin. A natureza funciona assim, brutal às vezes, para garantir a sobrevivência. É o que comprova a ciência. Longe daí, porém, concluir que a sociedade humana também tende a operar da mesma forma. A organização dos homens para viver juntos segue outras leis que refletem a capacidade humana, única entre os seres vivos, de superar sua herança genética. O homem cria regras de convivência, estabelece princípios morais, consegue ir além dos instintos, vai mais longe do que impõe seu DNA.
Tem que ser feita com base na sinceridade das pessoas.
Quem nos explica isso é Richard Dawkins, biólogo e professor da Universidade de Oxford. Ele é um neo-darwinista, uma das maiores autoridades mundiais em evolucionismo. Fomos encontrá-lo em sua casa repleta de livros em Oxford, no interior da Inglaterra. Muitas das obras são dele. Algumas traduzidas no Brasil.
We just heard about this discovery of fossils in Africa. We're about 160,000 years old. What is the importance of that discovery in the study of human evolution?
You know, I don't really understand that because, of course, any fossil, however old, has got to have predecessors. And so you can't pick on one fossil and say, this was the first human. Doesn't mean anything, because obviously its grandfather, its great-great-great-great-great-grandfather existed and was maybe a tiny bit less human, but there is no one moment at which in the succession of ancestor descendants leading towards us, you could suddenly stop and say, right, from now on they're human.
In this year, that we're celebrating 50 years of the discovery of the structure of DNA, when we think that Charles Darwin presented his theory in 1859, when even the basics of genetics wasn't known yet, and certainly long before DNA, now that we're celebrating this anniversary, is science confirming or correcting Darwin?
It's a good question. I think overwhelmingly confirming. There were aspects that he got wrong, and genetics you pinned down the one major thing he did get wrong, that he accepted the genetics of his day, which was a kind of blending substances model. You had a certain amount of genetic substance from your father and a certain amount of genetic substance from your mother, and they were kind of poured together into you, so you ended up in some unexplained way, intermediate. And it was already clear in Darwin's own lifetime that that actually couldn't be right, because if it was, each generation would be more uniform than the previous generation. You would get a loss of variation, and after a few generations we'd all look exactly the same. We'd all be a sort of medium appearance. So something like Mendelian genetics almost had to be true, and that was discovered in Darwin's lifetime, as you know, but he didn't know about it. And so the genetic revolution that took place in the early part of the 20th century, long before DNA, was the really important updating of Darwin.
Let's take evolution millions of years back to the creation of life itself from that mixture of water, carbon, gases that the original molecule evolved, from which we all descend. How did that come about?
Nobody knows how that came about, and most of what we speculate about really is just that. It's pure speculation. We may never know. what we can say on theoretical grounds is the kind of event that it had to be, which was the arising of a self-replicating entity. That's the key stage. There had to be something self-copying, self-replicating, something that makes copies of itself, which are usually identical to their predecessors, but a little tiny bit different occasionally.
That's what makes a variation.
Makes the variation. Once you've got that, then you've got all the ingredients in place for a primitive kind of natural selection. And that then built up over... Now we start to understand much more what's going on. Once natural selection proper begins, then we begin to understand how you get the whole panoply of evolution right from bacteria, well, pre-bacteria, to ourselves. But nobody knows the exact chemical events that went on. As I say, we may never know. So far, chemists have failed to repeat the events. Chemists who have tried to put plausible chemicals into a test tube or a bottle and shake them up and look for a self-replicating molecule have failed. And I think that's not in the least surprising. I think it would be positively surprising if it were easy to produce a self-replicating molecule, because if it were easy, that would mean that there must be life all over the universe. There must be life on practically every planet.
And we haven't found it.
And we haven't found it.
I went to a press conference recently in London with James Watson, one of the co-discoverers of the DNA structure. When he was asked how he saw the next 50 years in his area, and he said that he would see genetics and psychology coming together. What do you think of that?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, if I'd been asked, if I'd been him asked that question, I think I'd have said, I see dramatic increases in the speed with which we can, and the cheapness, the economic cheapness with which we can analyze DNA sequences, which will mean that, for example, in medical science, whenever you go to the doctor will know your genome and will prescribe for you the right pills, not just for an average person, which is what doctors do now, but specifically for you. I think that'll be a major change. I think in my own field of zoology, evolutionary zoology, it will mean that we shall know once and for all the true tree of life. We shall know exactly the sequence of branchings that led to the diversity of life that we have today, that's a very exciting thing. We now know approximately what the tree of life is like. But in 50 years, we shall know exactly, because we shall be able to take any pair of animals, any combination of animals and plants, look at their DNA, and work out exactly how long ago they had a common ancestor, exactly how long ago they branched.
You make an interesting observation in your book, and you say, as a scientist, I'm a Darwinian, but in politics and how we conduct our affairs, I'm a passionate anti-Darwinian.
Well, that comes in the first essay, which has the same title, A Devil's Chaplain, as the book itself, and it's the essay that gives the book its title. Contrary to expectation, I am not the Devil's Chaplain. Darwin himself said something like, what a book a Devil's Chaplain might write on the low, blundering, cruel. No, that isn't quite right. What Darwin meant was that not only if you go out and look at nature, you discover enormous cruelty, anguish, pain, but also that's what you'd expect from natural selection. Natural selection, the survival of the fittest. Even the most beautiful evolved beings, butterflies, cheetahs, gazelles, elephants, they are elegantly designed by natural selection, which means that lots and lots of their ancestors have died. Or rather, their ancestors survived, but their ancestors' rivals died to produce the perfection that we see now. So it is a ruthlessly cruel process which has carved out the elegant animals and plants that we see. Darwinism, then, is a cruel process. I am a passionate Darwinian as an academic scientist, in that I believe, because of the evidence, that Darwinian selection is the force responsible for the way life actually is. but I'm a passionate anti-Darwinian in that I would hate our own society to be modelled on Darwinian lines. I should hate to live in a kind of Thatcherite society where the weakest go to the wall, the strongest do best, get richest, have the most fun. That would be a sort of social Darwinian heaven, and it would be my idea of hell.
In other words, the fact that these laws apply to nature doesn't mean they have to apply to man and society.
That's right. And we should positively work against them in shaping our own societies.
In essence, that means that humans do have the capacity to rebel against their genes.
Yes.
As it were. That's unique amongst animals.
I think that's unique amongst animals, and that's another of the points that I make in the essay, A Devil's Chaplain. I actually concluded my first book, The Selfish Gene, by making a similar point that we must, I think the final words of the first edition of The Selfish Gene were, "We alone on Earth can rebel against the tyranny of the selfish replicators."
You also wrote that nature is neither kind nor cruel, but indifferent. So in the discussion then of what makes man, the old discussion genes of environment, you say it's both.
Well, Darwin, I think, used the word cruel in his original, and that's fine. But, of course, Darwin would really have meant indifferent. Nature isn't deliberately cruel, but the result is cruel, because nature has no interest in whether the antelope feels pain when it's caught by the lion. That's of no interest to nature. This is just the way things will turn out if natural selection works the way it does. You can expect to see a lot of pain. There will be a lot of pain, and there is.
And we are the results of a combination of that inheritance, that genetic inheritance from nature and what society gives us. We combine both.
We combine both, yes, and we are unique in that respect, I think.
People are more or less familiar by now with the concept of genes, of course, our biological inheritance. But you developed a parallel concept of memes, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. What is a meme?
Well, a meme is the genetic equivalent in the cultural sphere. So it is a unit of cultural inheritance, and it might be something like an idea or a tune or a clothes fashion or a religion, perhaps even. I mean, maybe a religion is more like a kind of complex of memes. The only point of developing it, and I developed this a long time ago in The Selfish Gene, my first book, was to downplay any suggestion that it's got to be genes that are the basis of Darwinian selection. What's got to be the basis of Darwinian selection is replicators. Anything that replicates will do. Genes replicate, but memes replicate too. Since I wrote The Selfish Gene, computer viruses have become very commonplace. And a computer virus is a very good example of a replicator. It makes copies of itself. It copies itself from one computer to another. It spreads exponentially as it goes, starting in one computer to 2, to 4, etc., and spreading outwards. That's a very good example of a replicator. I wanted to make the point to my readers of The Selfish Gene, who've just read a whole book about genes, that it hasn't got to be DNA, it hasn't got to be genes. Anything that self-replicates will do the job of being the basis for Darwinian selection. So something like an idea that has great survival value, an idea like belief in life after death, which spreads because people like the idea and because they tell their children about it, who tell their children about it, who tell their children about it. So although there's no evidence for it, it spreads because it has high spreadability. It has high
like
survival
what
value.
you call also a mind virus.
It's like a mind virus, yes. Yeah.
A new book out called The Closing of the Western Mind talks about the rise of faith and the fall of reason. It denounces the growth of irrationality. Do you see a trend towards irrationality in society?
I'm not very good at seeing trends. I'm not very confident in my ability to do so. I'm not sure. I could easily imagine being persuaded that there is a trend towards irrationality. I do get upset by the enormous number of people who take things like astrology seriously. and religion. But I don't know of any very good evidence that there's any increase in that kind of irrationality.
You mentioned in the case of religion that religious opinion want to be respected simply because they are religious. You know, is that your main argument?
It is a bit mysterious that we do, even those of us who are not religious, are expected to treat with great, deep respect religious beliefs. And so in our society, and I'm almost sure in Brazilian society as well, if there is some difficult moral issue being talked about, like abortion or cloning or something of that sort, you can more or less guarantee that among the people rounded up to talk about it, say on television, will be prominently religious spokesmen. So if there's a television program about cloning or about contraception or about abortion or something of that sort, the television company will almost certainly bring into the studio a bishop or a rabbi, because somehow society is expected to listen to such people, not because they've got something worthwhile to say, but because they are spokesmen of religious traditions. And there is an essay called Dolly and the Clothheads in A Devil's Chaplain, which attacks this automatic respect. I don't mind people having respect if it's deserved, but there's a kind of automatic respect for religion. You can't insult somebody's religion the way you are perfectly entitled to insult their politics. So you can say, I think communism stinks, or I think conservatism stinks. But you can't say, I think Christianity stinks. You're just not allowed to. We just don't do that.
You can't point out the historical errors in the Bible if it's taken literally, you know, that the man only exists for 6,000 years and so on. Is that what you mean?
Well, I mean that, but more than that, I mean the whole culture of exaggerated respect for religion over and above the respect we automatically have for each other. I mean, if you have different politics to me, I mean, say you're a supporter of George W. Bush, then I would argue with you and you would argue with me, and that would be fine. But there's no culture that says, oh, you're not allowed to disagree with somebody's politics. Of course you disagree with somebody's politics, and you say what you think. You say, I think your politics are rubbish. And you say, you think my politics are rubbish, and that's fine, that's accepted. But we're not allowed to do that about our religion. That's the point I'm making.
As an evolutionist, as a Darwinist, and a non-believer in an afterlife, what do you think then is the goal of life? Is it just life itself?
The goal of life is life itself in the sense of reproduction. It is propagation of genes. Now that's, of course, very different from the personal goals which we in our minds set up. And you and I both set up in our minds personal goals. I want to finish a book that I'm writing. One might say I want to marry a certain woman, or I want to write a symphony. There are all sorts of personal goals that we have, which are not the goals of life. And I would interpret them as manifestations of a capacity that the brain has to set up goals and follow them, which in our wild ancestors had a role to play. In nature, one would set up goals to find a water hole, to capture a buffalo. And the mechanism that our brains possess for setting up a goal of that sort, and that which was built into us by the ultimate natural selection goal of propagating genes, that mechanism of setting up goals to do things like catch buffaloes is now still in our brains, but it's been diverted into other goals, such as finishing a book, writing a symphony, or marrying a particular person.
Therefore, you don't accept the argument that, again, comes from a lot of religious people, that if you don't believe in an afterlife, you cannot establish moral principle.
I think that's a disgusting idea. It suggests that people are so morally weak that they need actually threats, carrots or sticks, in order to be good. And I think it's a horrible idea that we can't be good for any other reason that we are either seeking reward or afraid of punishment. There may be people like that, but there are so many good brights, which is a new word that's just been coined for non-religious believer.
Bright.
Bright, B-R-I-G-H-T. You can ask me about that if you like. There are so many good non-believers, as well as good believers, that it's clearly nonsense to say that the only reason people are good is that they're frightened of punishment or seeking reward. There are plenty of people who are good for some other reason than that.
You finish your book, The Devil's Chaplain, with a letter to your daughter in which you warn her against the corrosive influence of tradition, authority, and revelation. Can you explain how these, why these three elements bother you?
The book, the open letter to my daughter, who was then 10, was, I think, entitled something like Good and Bad Reasons for Believing. And I began by saying, have you ever wondered why we believe certain things? And I contrast evidence, which I say is a good reason for believing something, with these other things you've mentioned, like revelation, faith, tradition, authority. And I go through each of these in turn, explaining what evidence means, then explaining what tradition means, authority, faith, and revelation. And argue that she, as a 10-year-old, it's a bit hard for her to assess everything that she's told. But she could just begin to ask the question, when she's told something, is that the kind of thing which we probably know because of evidence? Or is it the kind of thing which is we probably don't know because of evidence, but which has come to us through tradition, revelation, authority, etc.? So if she's told something like an explanation for why winter comes and then summer comes, and winter comes and summer comes, or why day and night come in terms of the spinning of the earth, then she could ask herself, is that the kind of thing we probably know because of evidence? The answer is yes. But if she's told something like, it is wrong to use contraception, is that the kind of thing we get from evidence? No, obviously not. Or if she's told something like, well, almost anything religious, in fact, I could pick. And nearly all children are brought up in some kind of religious tradition. What I want to do is to encourage children to ask the question, where did that belief come from? Did that come from evidence? Or is that just something that's been handed down from generation to generation? Started from nothing, or started because somebody just simply made it up and handed on because that's the way society is. Society just does work in that way, that parents tend to hand on their beliefs to their children.
As Darwin indicated, evolution is a dynamic process, that never really stops. When we look at it today, where is evolution taking us now?
Well, life as a whole is going on in much the same kind of ways it always has, with certain differences which are imposed by humanity. There are large areas of the Earth where the ecology has been drastically modified by our species. So where once there was primary forest, there's now farmland, say. And the ecology of farmland is very different. It's not just we who are different, but many animals and plants have changed as a result of that. So there undoubtedly are changes. And until we go extinct, which presumably we will, most other species have, until we go extinct, we can expect evolution on this planet to be going through a rather strange blip at the moment. But it's fundamentally the same process. It's just that it's happening in a rather strange way temporarily because of us.
Some species will survive, some will disappear. And
well, a lot are disappearing. We are in the midst of a mass extinction comparable to some of the great mass extinctions that there have been in past eras. And we seem to be largely responsible for this one.